The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Ashworth Palace as Queen Consort Elena adjusted her pearl necklace nervously. The royal family's monthly visit to the children's hospital had concluded, and what should have been a routine journey back to the palace had turned into something far more complicated. In the back seat of the royal limousine, 8-year-old Princess Isabella sat rigid, her small hands clenched into fists on her lap. Tears streamed silently down her rosy cheeks, leaving tracks through the light powder that had been applied for the cameras earlier. Her usually bright blue eyes were red and puffy, and despite Elena's gentle attempts at conversation, the young princess remained stubbornly silent. "Isabella, sweetheart," Elena said softly, turning in her seat to face the child. "Would you like to tell me what's bothering you? We're family now, and family talks about their feelings." The princess turned her face toward the window, watching the countryside blur past. The rolling hills and ancient oak trees that normally delighted her seemed to offer no comfort today. Her bottom lip trembled as she fought back another wave of tears. Elena had been queen consort for only 18 months, having married King Alexander after his first wife, Princess Isabella's mother, had passed away in a tragic riding accident 3 years prior. The adjustment period had been challenging for everyone, but Isabella's grief and resentment had proven particularly difficult to navigate. "I want my real mama," Isabella whispered finally, her voice barely audible over the gentle hum of the limousine's engine. The words hit Elena like a physical blow. She had expected this moment, had prepared for it with the palace counselors and child psychologists, but hearing the raw pain in Isabella's voice made her heart ache. She reached out tentatively, but Isabella pulled away, pressing herself against the far door of the vehicle. Captain Marcus Thornfield, head of the Royal Guard, sat in the front passenger seat, his trained eyes constantly scanning their surroundings for potential threats. However, he couldn't help but notice the tension filling the passenger compartment. Through the rearview mirror, he observed the young princess's distress and the queen consort's obvious struggle to provide comfort. The limousine slowed as they approached a small village where crowds had gathered, hoping to catch a glimpse of the royal family. The driver, James Whitmore, had been with the royal household for over 20 years and had witnessed many family dramas, but the current situation weighed heavily on everyone in the vehicle. "Your Majesty," Captain Thornfield said quietly, "perhaps we should take the longer route through the forest road. It might give the princess more time to settle before we arrive at the palace." Elena nodded gratefully. The last thing Isabella needed was to face the waiting photographers and court officials while in such an emotional state. "Yes, thank you, Captain. That's very thoughtful." As they diverted onto the quieter forest route, Elena tried a different approach. Instead of pressing Isabella to talk, she began sharing a story about her own childhood, speaking in soft, measured tones about a time when she had felt scared and alone. "When I was your age," Elena began, "I had to move to a new country because my father was appointed as an ambassador. I didn't speak the language very well, and I missed my friends terribly. I remember crying every night for weeks, wishing I could go home." Isabella's sobbing had quieted slightly, though she still refused to look at Elena directly. Her small shoulders continued to shake with the effort of containing her emotions. "I thought I would never be happy again," Elena continued. "But slowly, very slowly, I began to make new friends. It didn't mean I loved my old friends any less, or that I forgot about my old home. It just meant that I had room in my heart for new love alongside the old." The princess finally turned from the window, her tear-stained face showing the first hint of curiosity. "Did you really cry every night?" "Every single night," Elena confirmed with a gentle smile. "And sometimes during the day, too, especially when no one was looking." "I cry when no one's looking, too," Isabella admitted in a small voice. Captain Thornfield felt a knot form in his throat as he listened to the conversation. He had a daughter of his own, and the vulnerability in both voices reminded him of the delicate nature of family bonds, especially in the unique circumstances of royal life. The limousine continued through the winding forest road, passing ancient trees that had stood sentinel over the kingdom for centuries. The dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy created patterns of light and shadow that danced across the interior of the vehicle, somehow making the atmosphere feel less heavy. "Isabella," Elena said carefully, I want you to know that it's okay to miss your mama. It's okay to be sad, and it's okay to not like me sometimes. Grief doesn't follow rules or timelines, and you're allowed to feel whatever you're feeling. The princess studied Elena's face intently, as if searching for signs of insincerity. Royal children learned early to detect false platitudes and empty promises, but something in Elena's expression seemed genuine. "Do you miss your mama too?" Isabella asked suddenly. The question caught Elena off guard. She had lost her own mother when she was 16, and while the grief had softened over the years, it had never fully disappeared. "Yes, I do. Even though I'm grown up now, I still sometimes want to call her and tell her about my day." "What would you tell her about today?" Elena considered the question seriously. "I would tell her that I met a very brave little girl who was dealing with something incredibly difficult, and that I'm proud of how strong she is, even when she doesn't feel strong." Isabella's tears had stopped flowing, though her eyes remained red and puffy. She seemed to be processing Elena's words, weighing them against her own complex feelings about her new family situation. The forest road stretched ahead of them, offering a peaceful respite from the formal constraints of palace life. In this temporary sanctuary, away from the expectations and protocols that governed their daily existence, something fragile but important was beginning to take shape between the woman who had reluctantly inherited the role of stepmother and the child who had never asked for a replacement for her beloved parent. Captain Thornfield made a subtle hand signal to the driver, indicating that they should continue on the scenic route for as long as necessary. The security detail following in the second vehicle had been notified of the delay, and arrangements were being made to adjust the evening schedule accordingly. As they rounded a bend in the road, a family of deer could be seen grazing peacefully in a meadow beyond the tree line. Isabella pressed her face to the window, momentarily distracted from her emotional turmoil by the sight of the graceful animals. "Mama used to say that deer were good luck," she said softly. Elena smiled. "Your mama sounds like she was very wise. What else did she used to say?" For the first time since entering the limousine, Princess Isabella began to speak freely about her mother, sharing memories and stories that she had kept locked away in her heart. Elena listened attentively, asking gentle questions and showing genuine interest in the woman who had come before her. The afternoon was drawing toward evening as their journey continued, but nobody in the royal limousine seemed eager to rush back to the formalities awaiting them at the palace. The gentle rocking motion of the limousine as it navigated the winding forest road had a calming effect on Princess Isabella. Her tears had dried, leaving only faint salt tracks on her cheeks, and her rigid posture had relaxed slightly. Elena watched the young girl carefully, noting how her breathing had become more regular, and how her small hands had unclenched from the tight fists they had formed earlier. Captain Thornfield continued to monitor the situation through discreet glances in the rearview mirror. His years of service had taught him that sometimes the greatest threats to royal family stability came not from external forces, but from the internal struggles that each member faced in their highly scrutinized lives. "Tell me about the White Rose Garden," Isabella said suddenly, her voice still hoarse from crying, but carrying a note of genuine curiosity. Elena's eyes brightened. The White Rose Garden had been her predecessor's pride and joy, a magnificent space that had fallen into neglect following the Queen's death. "You mean your mama's garden? I've been wanting to restore it, but I wasn't sure if that would upset you." "It's all overgrown now," Isabella said, a fresh wave of sadness crossing her features. "The gardeners don't take care of it anymore because Papa says it makes him too sad to look at." The limousine slowed as they approached a small stone bridge that crossed a babbling brook. Through the trees, the spires of Ashworth Palace were just visible in the distance, reminding everyone in the vehicle that their temporary sanctuary would soon end. "Would you like to help me restore it?" Elena asked carefully. "We could plant new roses alongside the old ones. Your mama's roses would still be there, but we could add some new varieties too. Maybe some pink ones, or yellow ones with your mama's white ones." Isabella considered this proposal with the seriousness that only a child could bring to such matters. Her small brow furrowed as she weighed the implications of Elena's suggestion. "What if I don't remember exactly how Mama arranged everything? Then we'll arrange them in a new way," Elena replied gently. "Sometimes when we try to recreate something exactly as it was, we end up feeling sadder because it's never quite the same. But if we create something new that honors the old, it can be beautiful in its own special way." Captain Thornfield found himself thinking about his own family's traditions and how they had evolved over the years. His grandmother's Christmas cookie recipe had been modified by his mother, and then again by his wife, but each version carried forward the love and memories of the previous generation while adding something new. The driver, James, slowed the vehicle further as they approached a scenic overlook. The valley below stretched out in shades of green and gold, dotted with small farmhouses and villages that had remained unchanged for generations. It was the kind of view that reminded everyone of the timeless beauty of the kingdom they served. "Could we plant some forget-me-nots too?" Isabella asked quietly. "Mama said they were called that because they help us remember the people we love." Elena felt tears prick at her own eyes. The request was so innocent, yet so profound, revealing the depth of Isabella's understanding about loss and memory despite her young age. "I think forget-me-nots would be perfect," Elena agreed. "And maybe we could create a special corner of the garden just for them, with a little bench where you could sit and think about your mama whenever you wanted to." The princess nodded slowly, seeming to find comfort in the idea of having a dedicated space for her memories. "Would you sit with me sometimes?" "Only if you wanted me to," Elena replied. "It could be your special place, and you could decide when you wanted company and when you wanted to be alone." As they continued their journey, Isabella began to open up about other aspects of her life that had been troubling her. She spoke about feeling confused during state dinners because she wasn't sure whether to call Elena Mama or Your Majesty in front of guests. She admitted to feeling guilty when she caught herself enjoying Elena's company because it felt like betraying her mother's memory. Elena listened to each concern with patience and understanding, never trying to rush the conversation or offer quick fixes for complex emotional issues. She had learned from her own experiences with loss that healing happened slowly, in small moments of connection rather than grand gestures of reconciliation. "You know," Elena said as they passed through a grove of ancient oak trees, "your papa and I talked about this before we got married. He told me that he would never ask you to call me Mama unless you wanted to. He said that title belonged to your real mama, and nothing would ever change that." "What did you say?" Isabella asked. "I said that I hoped someday we could be friends, and maybe eventually something like family, but that it had to happen naturally. I didn't want to force anything or pretend that I could replace someone irreplaceable." The honesty in Elena's voice seemed to resonate with Isabella. Royal children were accustomed to hearing carefully crafted responses designed to manage their expectations or protect their feelings, but Elena's straightforward approach felt refreshingly authentic. Captain Thornfield made a decision that would later prove significant. Instead of taking the final turn that would lead directly to the palace, he instructed the driver to continue along the longer route that would take them past the village where Isabella's mother had grown up. "Your Majesty," he said, turning to address Elena, "with your permission, I thought the princess might enjoy seeing her mother's childhood home. The current residents are loyal supporters of the crown, and they've maintained the property beautifully." Elena looked questioningly at Isabella, who had straightened in her seat at the mention of her mother's childhood home. "Would you like that, sweetheart?" "Could we really?" Isabella asked, her eyes lighting up for the first time that day. The small cottage came into view as they rounded the next bend. It was exactly as it had been during the late Queen's childhood, with climbing roses covering the front walls and a small garden filled with wildflowers. The current occupants, an elderly couple who had been friends of Isabella's grandparents, stood in their front yard and waved as the royal limousine passed slowly by. "Mama used to pick blackberries from the hedgerow behind the house," Isabella said, pressing her face against the window. "She said they made the best jam in the kingdom." "Maybe we could arrange a visit sometime," Elena suggested. "I'm sure Mr. and Mrs. Bank Pemberton would be delighted to show you around and tell you stories about your mama when she was your age." The idea seemed to fill Isabella with excitement and anticipation rather than sadness. For the first time since her mother's death, the prospect of learning new things about her seemed appealing rather than painful. As they finally turned toward the palace, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. The emotional intensity of the afternoon had given way to a calmer, more hopeful atmosphere. "Elena?" Isabella said softly. "Yes, sweetheart?" "Thank you for not trying to make me stop missing my mama. Thank you for giving me a chance to be part of your life," Elena replied. Captain Thornfield allowed himself a small smile as he observed this exchange. Sometimes the most important victories were the quiet ones, achieved not through force or strategy, but through patience and genuine care. The palace gates loomed ahead as the royal limousine approached the final stretch of their extended journey. However, instead of the usual smooth entry into the courtyard, Captain Thornfield noticed an unusual commotion near the main entrance. Several black sedans were parked in positions that immediately raised his alert level, and uniformed security personnel were stationed at intervals that suggested an unplanned but significant meeting was taking place. "Driver, take us to the private family entrance," Captain Thornfield instructed quietly, his hand moving instinctively toward his radio. Something's not right at the main gate. Elena noticed the tension in his voice and glanced forward, trying to see what had caused the sudden change in their route. In the back seat, Princess Isabella was still lost in thought about their conversation, tracing patterns on the foggy window with her finger. As they approached the smaller, more discreet entrance used by the royal family for private arrivals, Captain Thornfield's radio crackled to life. The voice on the other end was tense and professional. "Captain Thornfield, this is Lieutenant Hayes. We have a situation that requires immediate attention. The Duke of Wessex has arrived unexpectedly with his legal team and several members of the Royal Council. They're demanding an audience with His Majesty regarding Princess Isabella's custody and upbringing." Elena's blood ran cold. The Duke of Wessex was Isabella's maternal grandfather, a man who had made no secret of his disapproval of King Alexander's remarriage. He had been vocal in his belief that Isabella should be raised in his household, away from what he termed the complications of a blended royal family. "What is the nature of their complaint?" Captain Thornfield asked, keeping his voice low to avoid alarming Isabella. "They're citing the princess's emotional distress at today's public appearance. Apparently, someone photographed her crying in the car during the hospital visit, and the images have been leaked to several news outlets. The Duke is claiming this proves she's not receiving proper care in her current environment." Elena felt a surge of panic. The photographers had been positioned along their original route back from the hospital, which explained how they had captured images of Isabella's tears before the limousine's windows had been properly tinted for privacy. "Elena?" Isabella looked up from her window drawing, sensing the sudden change in atmosphere. "What's wrong?" "Nothing for you to worry about, sweetheart," Elena said, though her voice betrayed her anxiety. "Sometimes grown-ups need to have meetings about boring adult things," but Isabella was perceptive beyond her years, a trait that had been sharpened by the loss of her mother and the subsequent upheaval in her life. She could read the tension in Elena's posture and the concern in Captain Thornfield's voice. "Is grandfather here?" she asked, her small face creasing with worry. Elena hesitated. The Duke of Wessex's visits were always stressful for Isabella, as they typically involved long lectures about her proper heritage and subtle criticisms of her current living situation. "Yes, he is," Elena admitted. "But remember what we talked about earlier? About how you get to choose who you trust and who you feel comfortable with? That hasn't changed." Captain Thornfield made a swift decision. "Driver, continue past the family entrance and take us to the old stable courtyard. Lieutenant Hayes, we're going to delay the princess's arrival until we better understand the situation." "Copy that, Captain. His Majesty has been notified of your location and sends word that you should remain with the princess until he signals it's appropriate to bring her inside." As they drove toward the more remote stable area, Elena tried to process the implications of what was happening. The Duke of Wessex had been looking for an opportunity to challenge Isabella's living arrangements, and her public display of emotion had provided him with exactly the ammunition he needed. "I don't want to see grandfather right now," Isabella said quietly. "When he visits, he always asks me lots of questions about whether I'm happy, but he asks them in a way that makes me feel like I'm supposed to say no." Elena's heart ached for the child who was already dealing with complex emotions and now faced the additional stress of being at the center of an adult power struggle. The stable courtyard was peaceful and secluded, surrounded by old stone buildings that had housed royal horses for centuries. The driver parked beneath a covered archway that provided both shelter and privacy from any potential observers. "Princess Isabella," Captain Thornfield said, turning in his seat to address her directly, "I need you to know that your safety and happiness are the most important things to all of us. No matter what anyone says or does, You are loved and protected." His words carried the weight of his position and his genuine care for the young girl who had become like a daughter to many of the palace staff over the years. "What did those people take pictures of?" Isabella asked, her intuitive understanding of the situation surprising the adults. Elena decided that honesty was the best approach. "Someone took pictures of you crying in the car earlier, before we had our talk. Sometimes people use pictures to tell stories that aren't complete or true. But I was crying because I missed Mama, not because you were mean to me," Isabella said with the simple logic of childhood. "I know that, and Captain Thornfield knows that, and your papa knows that," Elena assured her. "The problem is that some people might try to use those pictures to suggest something different." Isabella sat quietly for a moment, processing this information with remarkable maturity. "Grandfather thinks I should live with him instead of with you and Papa. What do you think?" Elena asked gently. "I think Grandfather's house is very big and very quiet, and Mrs. Morrison makes terrible pudding," Isabella replied seriously. "And I think if I lived there I would miss Papa terribly, and I would miss our talks, and I would never get to help with Mama's garden." Captain Thornfield felt a surge of protectiveness for the small girl who was being forced to navigate adult complexities far beyond her years. His radio crackled again, and he stepped out of the vehicle to receive the update privately. When he returned, his expression was grave but determined. "The situation is escalating. The Duke has presented a formal petition to the Royal Council questioning the current custody arrangements. However, His Majesty has requested that we bring Princess Isabella to his private study through the back corridors, avoiding the main areas where the Duke and his party are gathered." "I want to talk to Papa," Isabella said firmly. "I want to tell him what I told you about Grandfather's house and about the garden and about everything." Elena looked at the young girl with newfound respect. Despite her earlier tears and confusion, Isabella was showing remarkable courage in the face of a difficult situation. "Are you sure you're ready for that conversation?" Elena asked. "It might be very serious and possibly upsetting." "I'm 8 years old, not 8 months old," Isabella replied with dignity that would have made her mother proud. "And Papa should know what I really think, not what other people think I should think." Captain Thornfield coordinated their movement through the palace's service corridors, a route that would allow them to reach the king's study without encountering the Duke's party. As they prepared to leave the safety of the stable courtyard, Elena took Isabella's hand. "Whatever happens," Elena said, "remember that you are brave, you are loved, and you have people who will always fight for what's best for you." Isabella squeezed Elena's hand in return. "Will you stay with me when I talk to Papa?" "If you want me to, I'll stay," Elena promised. "I want you to," Isabella said simply. "We're family now, remember? And family stays together during the hard parts." As they made their way through the ancient corridors toward what would prove to be a defining moment for their blended family, Isabella walked with her head held high, ready to speak her truth to those who would determine her future. The private study of King Alexander was a sanctuary within the palace, filled with leather-bound books, family portraits, and the comfortable furniture that spoke of a man who valued substance over ceremony. When Captain Thornfield quietly opened the heavy oak door, Isabella could see her father standing by the tall windows, his usually straight shoulders slightly bowed under the weight of the crisis that had erupted in his absence. King Alexander turned as they entered, and his face immediately softened upon seeing his daughter. Despite the formal setting and the serious circumstances, he opened his arms and Isabella ran to him without hesitation. "My brave girl," he murmured, lifting her into a warm embrace. "I've been so worried about you." "I'm okay, Papa," Isabella said, though her voice was slightly muffled against his shoulder. "Elena and Captain Thornfield took very good care of me." The king's eyes met Elena's over Isabella's head, and she could see both gratitude and apology in his expression. He had been caught off guard by the Duke's sudden arrival and the accompanying legal maneuvering, but his primary concern had always been his daughter's well-being. "Isabella," King Alexander said gently, setting her down but keeping his hands on her small shoulders, "I need to ask you some important questions, and I need you to give me completely honest answers. Can you do that for me?" "Yes, Papa. Are you happy living here at the palace with Elena and me?" Isabella glanced briefly at Elena, who gave her an encouraging nod, then looked back at her father with clear, determined eyes. Most of the time, yes, Isabella answered with careful honesty. Sometimes I get sad because I miss Mama, but that would happen no matter where I lived. And sometimes I feel confused about things, but Elena helps me talk about my feelings instead of keeping them locked up inside. King Alexander knelt down to Isabella's eye level, a gesture that had always made their conversations feel more equal and less intimidating. "Grandfather has come to visit because he's worried about you," the king explained. "He saw pictures of you crying today, and he thinks maybe you would be happier living with him and grandmother." "The pictures were from before Elena and I talked," Isabella said matter-of-factly. "I was crying because I missed Mama and because I felt guilty for sometimes liking Elena. But then Elena told me about when she had to move to a new country and how she cried every night, and she said it was okay to miss Mama and still make room for new love." Elena felt her heart swell with pride at Isabella's articulation of their conversation. The young girl had not only understood the complex emotional concepts they had discussed, but was now able to express them clearly to her father. "And what did you decide about that?" King Alexander asked gently. "I decided that loving Elena doesn't mean I love Mama less, just like planting new roses in Mama's garden wouldn't mean the old roses weren't special anymore." Captain Thornfield, standing discreetly near the door, found himself deeply moved by the wisdom coming from such a young person. In his years of protecting the royal family, he had witnessed many crises, but few had revealed such genuine emotional growth. A soft knock at the door interrupted their conversation. The king's private secretary, Mr. Aldridge, entered with obvious reluctance. "Your Majesty, the Duke of Wessex is becoming increasingly insistent about speaking with Princess Isabella directly. He claims that any conversation conducted without his presence cannot be considered valid for the purposes of his petition." King Alexander's jaw tightened. The Duke's heavy-handed approach was exactly the kind of pressure he had hoped to shield Isabella from, but it seemed unavoidable now. "What does that mean?" Isabella asked, picking up on the tension in the room. "It means grandfather wants to ask you questions too," Elena explained gently. "But remember what we talked about in the car. You get to tell the truth about your own feelings, and nobody can make you say something that isn't true. Will you and Papa be there when grandfather asks his questions?" King Alexander exchanged a look with his secretary. "I can insist on being present, but the Duke may argue that my presence influences your answers." "Then I want Captain Thornfield there too," Isabella said decisively. "He protects our family, and he heard everything Elena and I talked about in the car." The request was unusual, but not without precedent. Captain Thornfield had served the royal family for over a decade, and was considered beyond reproach in his loyalty and discretion. "If that would make you feel more comfortable, then that's what we'll do," King Alexander agreed. As they prepared to face the Duke and his legal team, Isabella surprised everyone by asking for a moment alone with Elena. "I want to tell you something before we go," Isabella said once the others had stepped outside. "Of course, sweetheart. What is it?" "When Mama died, I thought I would never feel happy again. And for a long time, I didn't. But today, when we were talking about the garden and about visiting her old house, I felt excited about something for the first time in a very long time." Elena knelt down to Isabella's level, feeling tears prick at her own eyes. "I think Mama would want me to be happy," Isabella continued. "And I think she would like you, because you don't try to replace her, or make me forget her. You just help me remember her in good ways, instead of only sad ways." "Your Mama will always be your Mama," Elena said softly. "Nothing will ever change that. But I hope that maybe there's room in your heart for me to be something special too, even if it's different." "There is," Isabella said simply. "And I want to tell grandfather that myself." The formal meeting was held in the palace's smaller conference room, a space that was less intimidating than the grand staterooms, but still conveyed the gravity of the proceedings. The Duke of Wessex sat at one end of the polished table, flanked by his legal advisors and two members of the royal council who had been sympathetic to his concerns. Isabella entered the room walking between her father and Elena, with Captain Thornfield following close behind. Despite her small stature, she carried herself with a poise that reminded everyone present that she was indeed a princess who had been raised to understand the weight of her position. "Isabella, my dear child," the Duke began, his voice carrying the formal affection that characterized their relationship. "I've been very concerned about you since seeing those distressing photographs in today's papers." "Hello, grandfather," Isabella replied politely. "I understand you have questions for me." The Duke seemed momentarily taken aback by her directness, but he quickly recovered his composure. "Indeed, I do. I want to understand whether you're truly happy in your current living situation, or whether you've been coached to say things that adults want to hear." Isabella looked directly at her grandfather, her blue eyes clear and unwavering. "I haven't been coached, grandfather, but I have been listened to, which is different." The distinction was subtle but profound, and several people in the room, including one of the royal council members, exchanged meaningful glances. "Tell me about your feelings regarding your stepmother," the Duke continued, using the formal term deliberately. "Elena is not trying to be my stepmother," Isabella corrected gently. "She's trying to be my friend and my family in a new way. There's a difference." For the next 30 minutes, Isabella answered every question with remarkable honesty and clarity, explaining her grief, her confusion, her fears, and ultimately her growing comfort with the new family structure that had been created around her. When asked directly whether she would prefer to live with her grandfather, Isabella's response surprised everyone. "I love you, grandfather, and I love visiting your house. But my home is with Papa and Elena. They don't try to make me choose between loving Mama's memory and being happy now. They help me do both." The Duke's legal case began to crumble as it became clear that Isabella was not the traumatized, neglected child he had portrayed, but rather a resilient young girl who was learning to navigate complex emotions with the support of adults who genuinely cared about her well-being. The formal meeting concluded with an outcome that surprised no one who had truly listened to Princess Isabella's words. The Duke of Wessex, faced with his granddaughter's articulate and heartfelt testimony about her happiness and security, found his legal position untenable. The royal council members who had accompanied him quietly withdrew their support for his petition, recognizing that the child's best interests were clearly being served by her current living arrangements. As the Duke and his legal team prepared to leave, he approached Isabella with a mixture of disappointment and grudging respect. "You've grown up considerably since I last saw you, my dear," he said, his formal tone softened slightly by genuine emotion. "I had to, grandfather," Isabella replied with simple honesty. "When sad things happen, you either grow up or you stay stuck in the sadness. Elena taught me that growing up doesn't mean forgetting." The Duke glanced at Elena, who had remained quietly supportive throughout the entire proceedings. For a moment, his stern expression wavered, revealing the grief-stricken father who had lost his own daughter and feared losing his connection to his granddaughter as well. "Perhaps I've been too hasty in my judgments," he admitted quietly. "Your grandmother and we miss your mother terribly, and we worry about losing the last connection we have to her." "You're not losing me, grandfather," Isabella said, reaching out to take his hand. "But I need you to trust that I can love Mama's memory and still be happy with Papa and Elena. Can you try to do that?" The Duke squeezed her small hand gently. "I can try, my dear. I can certainly try." After the formal parties had departed, the royal family found themselves alone in the quiet study once again. The stress and tension of the afternoon had taken its toll on everyone, but there was also a sense of relief and accomplishment in the air. King Alexander gathered both Elena and Isabella into a warm embrace, finally allowing himself to express the emotions he had kept carefully controlled during the formal proceedings. "I am so proud of both of you," he said quietly. "Isabella, you showed tremendous courage and wisdom today. And Elena, your patience and understanding have made all the difference in helping Isabella feel secure and loved." Captain Thornfield, who had remained a steady presence throughout the entire ordeal, felt a deep satisfaction as he observed the family's reunion. His role had extended far beyond physical protection today. He had helped safeguard the emotional well-being of a vulnerable child and supported the formation of authentic family bonds. "Captain Thornfield," Isabella said, turning to address him directly, "thank you for taking the long way home today. If we had come straight back to the palace, I might not have had time to talk to Elena about my feelings, and then I wouldn't have known how to explain them to everyone else. Sometimes the longest road leads to the most important destinations, Princess," he replied with a gentle smile. As evening settled over the palace, the royal family made their way to the private dining room for a quiet dinner together. The events of the day had created a new level of intimacy and understanding between them, built on honest communication and mutual respect. During the meal, Isabella brought up the subject of the White Rose Garden again, this time with King Alexander. "Papa, Elena and I want to restore Mama's garden together. We talked about planting new roses alongside the old ones and adding forget-me-nots, so I can remember Mama whenever I want to." King Alexander had avoided the garden since his first wife's death, finding the memories too painful to bear. But seeing Isabella's enthusiasm and Elena's gentle support, he realized that avoiding the space had only given it power over him. "I think that's a wonderful idea," he said after a moment of consideration. "Perhaps we could all work on it together, as a family project." "Really?" Isabella's face lit up with excitement. "Could we start this weekend? I don't see why not," Elena agreed. "We could visit the garden center and choose the new plants together." The conversation continued throughout dinner, covering practical plans for the garden restoration, as well as broader discussions about family traditions and how they might evolve to include new members while honoring the past. Later that evening, as Elena was tucking Isabella into bed, the young princess had one final important thing to say. "Elena?" "Yes, sweetheart. I've been thinking about what to call you. I know you said I never had to call you Mama if I didn't want to, and that's still true, but I was wondering, could I call you Mama Elena sometimes, when it feels right?" Elena felt tears spring to her eyes. The suggestion was perfect. It honored Isabella's birth mother while creating space for their new relationship to grow. "I would be honored if you called me that," Elena said softly, "but only when it feels natural to you. There's no pressure or expectation." "I think it feels natural now," Isabella said with a sleepy smile. "Good night, Mama Elena." "Good night, my sweet Isabella." As Elena quietly closed the bedroom door and made her way through the palace corridors, she reflected on the extraordinary day that had brought their family to this point. The crisis that had seemed so threatening that afternoon had ultimately strengthened the bonds between them and provided Isabella with an opportunity to voice her own choices about her future. Captain Thornfield made his final security rounds of the evening, checking the palace grounds and ensuring that all was peaceful and secure. In his report for the day, he would note that the royal family had faced and overcome a significant challenge, emerging stronger and more united than before. The White Rose Garden, which had stood neglected and overgrown since the death of the previous queen, would soon bloom again, with both old and new varieties, creating something beautiful that honored the past while embracing the future. In the months that followed, the garden became a gathering place for the family, where Isabella could share memories of her mother with Elena and her father, and where new memories were made among the flowers. The Duke of Wessex, true to his word, made an effort to accept Elena's place in Isabella's life, eventually becoming a supportive grandfather who valued his granddaughter's happiness above his own preferences. The photograph that had sparked the crisis was eventually forgotten by the public, replaced in the media by images of the royal family working together in the restored garden, laughing and creating something beautiful together. Princess Isabella grew up knowing that she was deeply loved by multiple people who each brought something unique and valuable to her life. She learned that families can take many forms, and that love has the capacity to expand rather than divide when approached with openness and respect. The events of that transformative day in the royal limousine had taught everyone involved that sometimes the most important conversations happen not in formal settings, but in quiet moments, when people feel safe enough to share their deepest feelings and fears. Captain Thornfield continued to serve the royal family with distinction, always remembering that his greatest achievement had not been preventing a physical threat, but helping to protect the emotional well-being of a young girl during one of the most challenging periods of her life. And Elena, who had entered the royal family with uncertainty about her role and her welcome, found her place not by trying to replace what had been lost, but by creating something new and beautiful alongside the precious memories that would always be cherished. The royal limousine, which had been the setting for the initial crisis and the beginning of healing, continued to serve the family on their official duties, but it would always be remembered as the place where a stepmother and stepdaughter first truly found each other. and where the foundations of a loving blended family were laid with patience, honesty, and genuine care.